a lot of cool stuff to do on it.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Questions for Hayes?
All right.
No.
Thank you very much, Hayes. Yay!
Good job. Nicely done.
I have a request before we have our next speaker. When you're finished with your presentation and we go to questions, can you stop sharing your screen so we can see you as we ask questions?
Oh, yeah.
Great. Thanks, Hayes. Do you want to introduce the next person?
Yeah, next up we have Robin, and I think she's telling us about urchins and things, but I'm not totally sure.
We'll find out soon.
Can you hear me?
Yes?
Okay, one sec. Okay, hi everyone, my name's Robin, and for my thesis I did research in an RU program this summer at UC Santa Barbara. So I'm going to switch things up a little bit and take us on a virtual field trip to the southern coast of California. So starting out, if you're unaware, these spiny creatures on the far right here are purple urchins, and they are really important because they graze on macroalgae such as giant kelp, and their two primary predators are spiny lobsters and California sheephead. And purple urchins are big players in the trophic cascades that we see off the coast of California. If you need a refresher on trophic cascades, you can think about how the removal of wolves in Yellowstone has led to this influx of ungulates in the system who then overgraze on the primary producers. And this same process can be applied back to our California kelp forests. The overfishing of spiny lobsters in this far left diagram leads to this influx of urchins who then overgraze on the kelp. So what we're seeing are these shifts from kelp forests in the top right to urchin barrens in the bottom right, which is really detrimental to the biodiversity of these marine systems. So to address this issue, California State has implemented a network of marine protected areas, which are regions where fishing is either completely restricted or has greater regulations. And so for our study, we focused on Anacapa Island in the Northern Channel Island, which has multiple management zones. It has the Old Reserve, founded in 1978, which is a no-take zone, meaning nothing can be fished. The New Reserve, founded in 2003, also a no-take zone. The Conservation Area, founded in 2003, where lobsters are fished but nothing else is fished. And then lastly, the Referenced or Fish Area that follows regular California state fishing regulations. And so because of these different management strategies, we have varying food web structures in these different areas. So in all of the marine protected areas, we primarily have these top predators who then regulate the number of urchins and allow the kelp to grow. However, in the Referenced or Fish Area, we primarily have urchins. So now I'm going to take you all on a quick dive so we can see these environments. This here is an urchin barren. You can see that the urchins are out on the reef, they're searching for food, and there are not a lot of predators around. And then this here is a kelp forest. You can see that there's a lot of food present for those urchins to eat. There are also a lot of predators swimming around, so those urchins are going to stay hidden and rely on drift kelp for food. Sorry. Oh no. And so seeing those different environments brought us to this question: do purple urchins alter their morphology in response to variation in predator abundance and resource availability? And the reason that we ask this question is it's important for understanding how to implement effective management strategies. So we hypothesized that purple urchins inside of the marine protected areas around Anacapa would be better apt to resist predation because there are more predators. And more predators means that the weaker urchins will be selected out. It encourages urchins to allocate energy towards their defenses, and it provides more kelp in the food chain for those urchins to allocate to their defenses. And so to test this hypothesis, we collected 20 urchins from 5 zones around Anacapa, from the conservation area, from the New Reserve, from the Old Reserve, and then from 2 sites within that fished area, from a barren site and from a kelp site. And then we took a bunch of body measurements. And then the exciting part is we took them to this mechanical test lab and physically crushed them to test their strength. And so we applied this force down onto these urchins until they cracked. And it's meant to mimic the force that a predator would need to crack into each urchin. And when we compared that between all 5 zones, we didn't see any strong differences in urchin strength. So because of that, we decided to look into other possible defenses, and one of those is spine length. So we took the 10 longest spines from each urchin and averaged those. And when we compared that between all 5 zones, we saw that urchins in the barren area of the fish zone had significantly longer spines than urchins from all of the marine protected areas. And this goes against our hypothesis. This is saying that urchins in that barren zone are actually more apt to resist predation than those urchins in the marine protected areas. And we think this could be because those urchins are out on the reef searching for food and way more exposed. So they need to be protecting themselves, whereas the urchins in the marine protected areas remain hidden. We also looked into energetic trade-offs in their defensive traits. For example, we compared that maximum load to that spine length. And we see this negative relationship in the marine protected areas between these 2 variables. So what that's saying is that if an urchin is putting energy into developing a stronger body, it puts less resources into developing longer spines. And this is really interesting because it shows us the adaptability of these urchins in different habitats. And then lastly, we looked into these small-scale spatial differences in urchin morphology. Specifically, we looked at gonadosomatic index, which is a measure of gonad weight divided by the wet weight of each urchin. And gonads are essentially the reproductive parts of urchins. And when we compared that between all 5 zones, we saw that urchins in the barren area had significantly smaller gonads than urchins in all the other zones, which makes sense because these urchins have less food to be allocating towards their reproductive system. However, what's really interesting about this finding is that those urchins in the barren area were just 15 feet away from the urchins in the kelp area of the fish zone. So that makes us wonder why those urchins wouldn't just move to find food. So overall, we have this alternative hypothesis that maybe urchins inside of the marine protected areas are less apt to resist predation because they remain hidden, and so they do not need to allocate resources towards their defenses, whereas urchins in the fish zone are out in the open and need to do so. We also saw these interesting energy allocation trade-offs telling us about the adaptability of urchins. And then lastly, we saw these small-scale differences in urchin morphology, which tells us about the movement of them. So overall, we conclude that predator risk is not just about the abundance of predators, but it also has to do with the behavior of the prey, whether they're out on the reef or hidden. And then lastly, the habitat type and whether that provides a lot of food or not. And I think the most important finding from this study is its implications for management strategies. Because if these urchins in the fish zone really are stronger and better apt to resist predation, then we really need to have intense management strategies to shift barrens back to kelp forests. Thank you all so much for listening. I want to thank a lot of people, but of course I would like to thank the environmental program for an incredible 4 years. Thank you. Questions?
Hi, Robin. This is Miro. Just a couple of questions. Do you think this would be phenotypic plasticity or some kind of an evolutionary response of the urchins when you went into the study?
I think that it would be phenotypic plasticity. I think that these urchins in differing environments really can alter whatever they need to be able to adapt to that environment. And there have been some studies on urchins and show that they are very much very plastic animals.
Okay. Thanks.
Hey, Robin, this is Eric. Was there any attention paid during the study to age, or are these juveniles existing on the barrens? Was there any kind of class sorting there for the age of the urchin itself, or was that sort of like not part of the sample study?
So it was kind of hard to know the age of the urchin, but we took a range of size classes from each. Okay. So we tried to keep that in mind in our study.
I have one more question. What is? Oh, sorry. Go for it.
Mine's a novice question. Sorry, Robin. I was wondering. We're thinking about the management regimes and the time in which they were imposed. How long does it take a kelp forest to reestablish? And you mentioned the urchins aren't moving much. I'm assuming the predators are. And did you account for that kind of difference in mobility?
Yeah. Kelp forests, honestly, the kelp forests in that area only took a few years to reestablish after they put that management into place, which is really impressive and shows you how effective that management is. And what was your second question?
It's just strange that like the urchins, you said they didn't seem to be moving despite opportunities to. And
Yeah.
like I said, I'm a novice, but that seems striking to me.
Yeah, the urchins, there's not a lot of studies on how urchins move and how far they can go and how long it takes them. But I think that this study really points out that like they don't really move very much probably, and that would just adapt to that environment instead. Okay. I think next up is Charity Jones.
Great job,
Congratulations.
Robin.
Good job, Robin.
Congratulations.
Okay. So my thesis was on examining the legacy of severe burn on soil carbon cycling in the Hayman Burn here in Colorado. So a little bit of background. As the climate continues to warm, we're expecting fire severity and frequency to increase. And what this looks like is that more CO2 is going to be released into the atmosphere and less carbon is going to be stored into the soil. However, the magnitude of these changes are poorly understood, and how the microbial communities will respond to these changes also remains poorly understood. So my research question was, how does soil carbon cycling differ between burned and unburned landscapes? And are these differences due to organic matter quality or soil microbes? And my hypothesis here was that vegetation would establish following fire, and this change in vegetation and thus organic matter quality would also change the microbial communities, which would change the cycling, creating a positive feedback loop. So here are our study sites. On the left, we have unburned sites. They're characterized by ponderosa pine and have pine litter and duff covering the soils. And on the right here, we're looking at our burned sites. These were burned in the Hayman fire in 2002. And as you can see, there's not a lot of recovery happening, even 17 years post-fire. Our burn sites are characterized mainly by grasses, forbs, and woody debris. There are a few trees still standing, but for the most part, the Hayman burn was stand replacing, so there's not many trees left. For methods, we took 9 soil samples at 3 different hill slope locations, the crest, the mid, and the toe. We then took those samples, put them in jars, and measured respiration for 6 weeks. We also measured the C13 isotopes, as well as the percentage of carbon and percentage of nitrogen that's in the soil. We then took the soil and we looked at the microbial communities, and we sequenced their genome and looked at ESVs at 99% similarities. And what we found, not surprisingly, is that fire significantly reduces organic matter. So on this left-hand side here, you can see that the percent nitrogen in burned areas is much less than the percent carbon in burned areas is much less than the percent carbon in unburned areas. And that's the same with percent nitrogen. Burned has significantly less than unburned. We attribute these losses mainly to post-fire nutrient losses, as well as soil leaching, erosion, and different microbial cycling. However, we did see something interesting. When we looked at the respiration rates in those jar experiments, we saw that unburned soils only respired 15% more carbon than burned soils. And when we normalize this rate to the amount of carbon in the soil, what you're looking at on the bottom here, burned soils are 63% more bioavailable than unburned soils, just because they respire a lot, but they do have less carbon. So we first attributed this to organic matter quality and processing differences. So there's a lack of forest recovery in burned areas, which means there's different organic matter inputs. So burned soils likely have a smaller labile organic matter pool, as well as different microbial communities. So for example, unburned sites have more pine litter and duff, and this is made up of lignin, and lignin tends to have a prolonged depleted signature of C13, which is what we're seeing here. The blue is more depleted in C13 than the red burn soils. And what this leads to is more tighter carbon and nitrogen cycling, which means that carbon and nitrogen can't build up in the soil, which means it's harder for trees to establish. Next, we looked at microbial communities. So vegetative communities is a dominant driver of microbial community establishment, and we do see differences between burned and unburned communities. Here you can see in red again that burned communities are more closely clustered to each other than unburned communities. We also saw that burned communities have more nitrifying bacteria, which these lead to more mineralization of organic matter, and thus that's why we see the increase in respiration. Burned communities also have a lower species richness in total, and that also leads to decreased soil respiration and that leads to decreased carbon sequestration. So in conclusion, the increased soil carbon bioavailability within burned landscapes decreases total carbon storage. And this likely leads to the establishment of more grasses as opposed to trees, as there's less carbon and nitrogen. And we attribute this to primarily the establishment of these grasses following the fire, which creates a positive feedback loop for the bacteria. Finally, I would just like to say thank you, especially to my advisor, Becca, for all of her help, and to the Yale Institute for Biospheric Studies and Colorado College for funding, and for Colorado State for letting us use their labs. So does anybody have any questions?
I have a question. What are the methods for seeing all the different species of microbes in the soil?
Yeah, so basically we looked at RNA. So we extracted RNA and then sequenced it with using the UParse pipeline, which basically just like pairs it with known species. We're looking less at a species level and more of like a group level. Cool. So I guess we're going to take a break, and then we're going to hear from Noah.
Congratulations. Great job, Tristan.
Good job, Cherry.
Good job. That was really interesting.
You all are so on it that we're actually ahead of schedule, which is kind of amazing. Great job, everyone, really sticking to the time. So we were scheduled to start again at 2:10. I think we should probably stick with that. So if people are trying to hop in at certain times, they will be ready to go. So then you have an 18-minute break. Maybe be back in 15. So we're ready to hop on with Noah. Thanks, everyone. See you in a minute.
Thank you. They actually sent us these to put on.
I know. I'm always, I was like, wow. I was like, so fancy pants.
All right, Noah, you want to get started?
Sounds great.
Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. My name is Noah Hirschhorn, and this past summer, I worked as part of the NASA Student Airborne Research Program, and I'm excited to share the results of my senior thesis, analysis of the vertical profile of aerosols over the Salton Sea during SARP 2019. Some front-end acknowledgements. Thank you so much to my SARP mentors, Alexander McDonald, Andreas Beiersdorf, and Roya Baharini, as well as my Colorado College advisor and mentor, Lynn Gratz. So to get started, we need to kind of understand the Salton Sea region itself. And the Salton Sea is a large endorheic lake sitting on the borders of Riverside and Imperial counties in Southern California. And because it's endorheic, the lake doesn't have a drainage point, and the current salinity of the Salton Sea is about 60 parts per trillion. Compared to the salinity of the ocean at about 35 parts per trillion, this is a significant higher amount. And as the lake has been drying, this has been exposing playa. And playa is defined as lake bed that is once covered but is now exposed. And this playa is expected to continue to expose, and when aerosolized, the playa can be extremely detrimental to air quality, and the Salton Sea itself has been one of the main reasons that air quality in Imperial County is some of the worst in the country, as seen by high asthma rates, especially among children living in Imperial County. leading into some goals of the study that I had was to first classify aerosols based on type over the Salton Sea. Now, aerosols are tiny particles, and recent studies, specifically by NASA and the NASA Langley Airborne Research Center, have classified 8 different types of aerosols, including dust, smoke, urban, maritime, and the others that I have listed. What we wanted to also do was to differentiate layers to determine which layers were actually emitted because of the Salton Sea or have been influenced by the Salton Sea, and also the surrounding playa of the Salton Sea. And we could also then try to find out which different air layers were influenced by regions outside of the Salton Sea. We also wanted to verify remote sensing data with aircraft and ground data. So we had the opportunity to do a flight over the Salton Sea, and these flights occurred as part of NASA SARP, and our flight took place on July 17th, 2019. It included a high pass at 3,200 meters for remote sensing, which I will get into, a descent, and then a low pass to ensure airborne in situ data could be analyzed. And the red on this figure is the high pass, the green is the descent, and the yellow is the low pass, and then we continued on with the flight. So the main instrument that we use for aerosol classification is a type of LiDAR called DIAL, which is differential absorption LiDAR. Now, LiDAR utilizes lasers this specific LiDAR utilizes lasers mainly at 532 nanometers and 1064 nanometers, and the way that they reflect on light tells us these following properties, which can be used to classify aerosols, including aerosol spectral depolarization ratio, telling us kind of the shape of the aerosol, extinction, and extinction being the combination of aerosol absorption and scattering, was a parameter that we used to try to figure out where aerosols were. Backscatter color ratio could help tell us about particle size. The 532 nanometer depolarization ratio is another shape property, as well as the LiDAR ratio, which is this all-encompassing measurement of size, shape, and composition that is mainly used with this type of remote sensing. Beyond remote sensing, we also use large instrumentation, which is, no pun intended, a really large instrument that tells us a ton of different optical properties. The proton transfer reaction time of flight mass spectrometer, which could tell us a little bit about airborne DMS. Whole air sampling canisters were ground-based samples taken where we have these different pins, and those told us also about DMS, as well as high split back trajectories. So first and foremost, the DIAL results, and we kind of have to go through this a little bit quicker than I would like. But on the left, we have extinction profiles in a north and south region over the Salton Sea. And we have boxed regions that we wanted to investigate because we were looking mainly at the lower troposphere. So we have a 200-meter region in both the north and the south where there is a high value of aerosol extinction. The maximum in each region was at 500 meters, so we evaluated that. And we also wanted to evaluate 800-meter layers because we have this little interesting change in the rate of change of the extinction. So we wanted to see what was there. Now the plot on the right is an example plot that we took for a lot of different parameters within these classification aforementioned parameters, but this one specifically is LiDAR ratio on the y-axis and spectral depolarization ratio on the x-axis. What I want to note is that the LiDAR ratio values in 200-meter layers are quite low, with higher LiDAR ratio values at 800 than at 200, but much higher in the north than the south. Another thing to note here is that the 500-meter layer is quite variable. So for example, we see in the north some of the values in this green 500-meter layer resemble more of the 800-meter layer, and then some of the values are actually closer to the 200-meter layers. The biggest takeaways from this data is that there is a low LiDAR ratio at 200 meters, higher LiDAR ratios at 800 meters, and there's a high level of variability in the 500-meter layers. Also, there were lower depolarization values indicating more spherical properties, as well as medium color ratio values, which told us that the particle size was relatively medium in the grand scheme of things as compared to other particles. Some other instrument results. Because of low LiDAR ratio values at the 200-meter layer, this corresponds with maritime aerosol, so we wanted to take a look at some DMS concentrations as well, because DMS is very highly produced in ocean regions due to ocean phytoplankton and other biogenic activities characteristic of maritime regions. and we found that there were significantly higher DMS levels on the playa as compared to control locations, and some of these control locations were within sight of the Salton Sea. We can also see that there are high levels of DMS as we flew over the Salton Sea, and these also corresponded to higher levels of aerosol concentrations. Moving on to some of the discussion. At the 200-meter layer, we found that dial instrumentation supports a maritime classification. We also took a look at some regional phenomenon to try to explain some of the deviations in optical properties. One example is that the maritime aerosol we observed was actually coarser in shape than maritime aerosol normally. But we found because the Salton Sea has relatively lower relative humidity than the ocean region where maritime aerosol is observed, NaCl, which is a common compound within maritime aerosol, remains more cubic than spherical, which helped to explain that deviation. We also found that elevated levels of DMS resemble levels seen in maritime environments, and we have two back trajectories, one at 200 meters in the north traveling directly over the Salton Sea, and one at 200 meters in the south traveling over the Salton Sea region in the Sea of Cortez. At 800 meters, the north could fall into a variety of different classifications, but the back trajectory traveling directly over San Diego does suggest an urban influence. More work would be needed to confirm this. In the south, we had a mild LiDAR ratio value that fell well within the fresh smoke range, and by accessing a firm's database, which tells us about the location of wildfires, we are able to determine that it actually was passing over the Baja Peninsula, where there was a wildfire that started the day before, which is something we observed in the pre-flight briefing. Some conclusions of this study is that aerosols during SARP 2019 that were emitted from the Salton Sea region were sharing similar properties to maritime aerosol on dial instrumentation. More work and more data sets can help really confirm this finding. Second, we found that airborne and ground-based data support a maritime classification, as we saw with these elevated levels of DMS and back trajectories. We also found that aerosol emissions from other regions are having an impact on the Salton Sea. An article published a few years back talked about how a rotten smell from the Salton Sea reached LA, and air from these coastal cities can also reach the Salton Sea region. And with that, I have some acknowledgements for people from NASA, as well as Matt Cooney at GIS and the CC Conference Grant, and I would like to open it up to any questions.
Okay, thanks. I think we have time for just one question for Noah. Anyone?
Noah, if going back to the high rates of asthma in the under Salton Sea, and knowing that the air comes from many places, do you think that the main way to solve those asthma rates is locally, or to work on sources of pollution from other places?
That's a great question. And in an ideal world, I think that both would be great, because we know that the LA air quality is a problem. I think that within Imperial County, it is a really good way to at least start, because if we found a way to take some legislative action to help solve the problem at the Salton Sea, which is more of this playa becoming exposed and aerosolized, it would be possible to help lessen some of those severe effects seen. But again, in an ideal world, we could get some legislation in both the coastal cities and Imperial County.
Thank you.
Good job, Noah! Woo! Congratulations!
Hey, Noah, if you ever want to read more on the Salton Sea, Salt Dreams by Bill DuBois is a great read. That's all I got.
Will do. Thank you. I would like to now introduce Margot Flynn, who is going to tell us about her thesis about ozone.
All right. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Cool. So last summer and into the school year, I worked with Professor Lynn Gratz on a set of ozone data collected by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And my thesis focused on ozone near the Earth's surface, produced from anthropogenic emissions like nitrous oxide and volatile organic compounds. And unlike ozone up high that protects us from solar radiation, ozone at the surface is biologically harmful and also functions as a greenhouse gas. So there are standards in place to try and ensure that ozone doesn't get above levels harmful to human environmental health. I first just wanted to give a little bit of a chemistry background so we can all start on the same page. As I mentioned earlier, ozone is produced by other emissions, Ozone's not created at the source, so the precursor emissions must undergo a series of reactions to generate ozone. And here I've outlined 3 steps that create ozone from NO2. Based on this series of reactions, we would expect to see a null cycle where ozone doesn't persist as a product. But because of the rate relationship on the right, we know that when the production of NO2 exceeds the production of NO, we break the null cycle and get higher production rates of ozone. Because ozone is only created during the daytime due to NO2 photolysis, at night NO depletes ozone. The result is a diurnal curve where ozone is the highest during the day and lowest at night. Right now, Colorado Springs is hovering just below the National Ambient Air Quality Standard for ozone, which is 70 parts per billion. Because the precursor emissions that create ozone commonly come from human activity, we can expect that our increasing population threatens our compliance with the ozone standard. Here I've put a little circle around just how close our upper end of ozone counts was to the standard in 2018. And it's worth mentioning that the blue and orange lines on these graphs are the 2 permanent ozone monitors in the Pikes Peak region. When we're really close to non-compliance, it becomes important for these monitors to represent ozone in the whole city, especially as population and vehicle use increase. We need to understand ozone behavior and make sure we're monitoring as well as possible and keeping people and our environment safe. Through this work, we hope to contribute to the body of knowledge about ozone behavior in the Front Range and assess the representativeness of these permanent sites in the Pikes Peak region. So from June through September 2018, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment added 6 temporary monitors in the area, 4 of which measured wind speed and direction. Their intent was to collect ozone data around the city to compare to the data they get from their 2 permanent monitors in the hopes of testing the representativeness of the permanent sites. The summer months were chosen because summer is typically the season in which there's consistently high ozone due to increased sunlight. And site locations were chosen to get the best topographical and geographical spread of the city, but we're also limited by what property owners or prior relationships allowed the CDPHE to set up monitors. We found that sites closest to the highway had the lowest ozone counts due to nitric oxide titration. Because of the chemical properties of ozone, before nitric oxide becomes NO2, it acts as a sink for ozone. NO comes out of the tailpipes of vehicles, so it makes sense that the highway corridor would, as a whole, be a sink for ozone. This effect becomes problematic when a permanent site is located too close to the corridor. The red line in the left figure and the red box in the right figure are one of the CDPHE's permanent sites located at the Air Force Academy, just 1.3 kilometers from I-25. The other low bias site in these figures is located near the tennis courts on our school campus and is only 0.4 kilometers from I-25. So you can really see the effect on ozone counts there. Our second finding is that elevated ozone at high elevation sites is due to upslope daytime winds. We found that the 95th percentile of ozone mixing ratios increased about 1.1 parts per billion with every 100 meters of elevation, which is consistent with other findings in the Front Range. We also combined daytime wind data and we combined daytime wind data with data from the 2017 National Emissions Inventory to see where point source polluters were located in proximity to our sites, which is the figure on the right. All sites with wind data show ozone coming loosely from the direction of the city center, where point source emitters are located. This relationship can be explained by upslope and downslope wind patterns. If you've taken atmospheric dynamics, you might be familiar. During the day, the sun heats land surfaces facing the sun earlier, such as the foothills of Pikes Peak, which in turn heat adjacent air, which becomes warmer and less dense, and therefore rises to higher elevations, creating upslope winds. The compounding effects of daytime upslope winds originating from the city and daytime production of precursor emissions in the city leads to elevated ozone at higher elevations, away from the urban corridor where most of the precursor emissions are being produced. Our final finding was that the permanent ozone monitors are slightly low biased in a horizontal sense, but are slightly high biased based on their elevations. We plotted all of the sites during our study period in GIS and on Excel during one identified high ozone event. Then we removed the permanent sites one at a time from each model to see how the model would predict ozone at the location or elevation of the missing site. We used GIS for the horizontal model because it doesn't take elevation into account, and we used Excel for the vertical model because it doesn't take horizontal geography into account. With the GIS model here, we can see that the interpolations overestimate ozone mixing ratios at permanent sites by 1 to 5 parts per billion. And this is most apparent between figures A and B, where the presence of Manitou, marked with the nickname Man at the bottom of the figure, creates a sort of low ozone intrusion in figure A into the foothills, where in figure B, you see the model predicting higher ozone through that area. The opposite is true when we look at sites with respect to elevation. Here, both the permanent sites, which are marked in red, are slightly above the linear regression. In this case, the model predicts lower than what the actual values were, although it's important to note that the low bias Colorado College site, which is that left and lowest blue point, is probably affecting the linear regression. And in this case, the biases are within the CDPHE calibration criteria, meaning that they're too small to be addressed by large scale changes. But it's important to know that they exist because in the future, knowing that these kind of factors are affecting the representativeness can help avoid the smallest biases. Based on our study, we find that the permanent site at Air Force Academy is low bias due to proximity to the highway corridor, and that the permanent site in Manitou is low bias due to complex topography and possibly due to its proximity to Highway 24. Current permanent sites should stay in place for the sake of long-term data collection, but because of the relationship between ozone and elevation and the growing population in the Pikes Peak region at risk of being exposed to unhealthy levels of ozone, we suggest that future monitoring sites be placed in higher elevation areas with high population density. And I've kind of outlined that with a little red circle on here, just east of Academy and south of Black Forest. We think that monitoring higher elevation areas that are populated is a more conservative and tactical approach to paint an accurate picture of ozone exposure in Colorado Springs, and will be really important going forward. I just wanted to thank Professor Lynn Gratz for really giving me a chance to dig in, and thank SCORE for funding summer research, also Matt Cooney and Francis Russell for help with GIS, and everyone else, and also the CDPHE for giving me this data. Thanks, and I'll answer a couple questions now if we have time.
I'm wondering in what sense you might have had some problems with confounding of hydrocarbons with elevation. As you go up in elevation, you also have a lot more forest, and there's a lot more hydrocarbons there. So I'm wondering in what way you could actually tease those out of the hydrocarbon model versus the elevation.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't have quite the time or resources to look at the difference between stuff like isoprene and whatnot in this area. I think that's would be really valuable. And it would be interesting to see. A lot of research has been done in the Northern Front Range, and it'll be interesting to see how much their models take that into account, because that wasn't something we got a chance to do with this research. So definitely future research. Yeah.
Thanks.
Margot, do you know what the point sources in downtown of Knox are?
Yeah, I think the top 3, I'm just like trying to remember what they are. I think the top 3 in Colorado Springs are Martin Drake, Ray Nixon, and the airport. Cool. If there's no more questions.
Great
job. Great job, Margot. Nicely done.
I'd like to introduce Saria, who also worked with Lynn.
Oh, Saria.
Yes. I'm sorry for the delay. So hi, everyone. I've been working with Professor Lynn Gratz in investigating mercury concentration in the songbirds of Southeast Michigan. My research is a part of a bigger project in Eastern Michigan University that is looking at the impacts of heavy metal pollution on urban wildlife. So before I begin, I want to make a quick note that I'm a December graduate. So I'm still working on my thesis, and the results are from the analysis I've had so far. So there are a few more things I'm hoping to analyze. So please bear with me. So as many of you might be aware, mercury is a persistent environmental pollutant that is released from the anthropogenic emissions like coal power plants and other industrial point sources. Once mercury is released into the atmosphere, it enters the aquatic and terrestrial ecosystem where it is converted into methyl mercury, and this is toxic as it bioaccumulates and biomagnifies within the food chain. The impacts of mercury as a neurotoxin on humans is relatively well known, but researchers have also found that sublethal levels of mercury in birds could impact their neurological and reproductive functioning, which could reduce their fitness and potentially threaten their population. These researchers have, however, focused mainly on large aquatic and migratory birds who have higher tolerance than songbirds. So this research was motivated by the desire to understand the impacts of mercury on small terrestrial songbirds that are sensitive and are at risk from urban pollution. Our findings contribute to the better understanding of heavy metal pollution and its effect on the health of urban songbirds. So our main goal was to measure mercury levels in the feathers of songbirds and understand how it varied according to their dietary pattern, age, sex, their foraging habitat, as well as their proximity to emission sources. Our study site was focused in Flint and Ypsilanti in Michigan. Southeast Michigan is particularly a heavily industrialized area with power plants and past automotive industries releasing mercury to its local atmosphere and waterways. Michigan is also among the top 10 states with the highest mercury emission in the country. So in the summer and fall of 2018 and 19, we captured and collected 223 feathers from 4 different species of songbirds as listed on the screen. And just in case you were wondering why we used feathers, they serve as a good proxy for dietary intake and provide site-specific information on mercury exposure. So after the feathers were collected, we cleaned them in the lab to remove any external contamination. The feathers were digested for overnight using concentrated nitric acid, followed by 3 hours of heating to completely dissolve the feathers. We then diluted the solution with bromine chloride and used the Techran mercury analysis system, following the EPA method to measure for the total mercury concentration. And so in order to test for lab accuracy, we used certified human hair reference material, and our recovery rate was close to 91%. We also oven dried a second pair of feather from the same bird to account for its moisture content and calculate the dry feather weight. So moving on to the results, we found that the average mercury concentration in these songbirds were 222 nanograms of mercury per gram of dry feather weight. As you can see in the graph, the concentration varied significantly among the 4 different species of birds. We found the highest in American robins right here, and the lowest in American goldfinches. Although our samples did not exceed the sublethal level, 4 of our American robins had level close to 3,000 nanograms per gram, which is the level at which 10% reduction in nestling success is seen. So following this result, we inferred that this species level difference is likely due to their varying dietary patterns. And so based on this classification, we found that omnivores had approximately 8.7 times higher mercury concentrations than the carnivores. And as you might have already guessed, this is due to the bioaccumulation of mercury as we go up higher in the food chain. In terms of age, we found that juveniles had twice the mercury level than the adults. The result was rather surprising because we had expected adults to have accumulated more mercury based on the long-term exposure and subsequent chronic body burden. But there are a few reasons as to why this might have been the case. First, since juveniles are still developing their feathers, they're able to depurate substantial amount of mercury from blood into their growing feathers. Other researchers have also found that although blood mercury level is lower in juveniles, their feather levels could still be higher due to this mechanism. Juveniles also tend to have high metabolic and nutritional demand, meaning their quick growth rate allows for higher food intake per body size. The parents are also likely to feed more nutritional and protein-rich food to optimize the nestling growth. So the combined effects of these 2 factors could increase the dietary intake of mercury in juveniles. Our results indicate that understanding mercury concentrations in juvenile and nestling is especially important because it is a sensitive period where their neural networks are still developing, and this could affect their later life. Lastly, in terms of sex, we didn't find any significant difference between male and female. This indicates that both the sexes are feeding on a similar diet and have quite the similar bioaccumulation rate. Earlier, we had expected females to have lower concentration because of their smaller body size, as well as their ability to depurate into eggs during their breeding season. But we concluded that this depuration effect could be a transient process since feather growth occurs after the breeding season and also depends on how long the mercury is in the body. So as I conclude my findings, it is important to acknowledge that the birds might slightly change their diet during their breeding and molting season. Additionally, some birds might be eating from feeders for which the food source might not be true to its location. So the extension of this project will include a spatial emission source map where I'll locate the proximity of our sampling sites to better understand the fate of mercury and its distribution in different habitats of the songbirds. I'll also compare watered and unwatered sites to see if there is an indirect effect of aquatic habitats on terrestrial songbirds. And lastly, I'm also hoping to analyze the impacts of other heavy metals in these songbirds. So yeah, I would like to thank Professor Lynn Gratz, Dr. Cornelius, and her students for the opportunity to research and collaborate with their project. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to Darren and Dr. Majestic for helping me with LabWorks. Thank you for listening. Any questions?
A very silly question, but how did you get the feathers off the birds? How'd you catch the birds and then get the feathers?
That's a great question. So I have a collaborator in Eastern Michigan University who are like capturing birds. So they basically capture through using the net. And once they like literally capture it, we just pluck in like 2 feathers. Like I'm not a like bird expert, but someone else helped me like collect these feathers.
Can you let them go again?
yeah, we did let them go back again, yeah.
Sadia, how many species of birds in total are you planning to look at when you're done with your thesis?
We have 4 different species of songbirds: American robin, American goldfinch, European starling, and house sparrows. Yeah.
And Saria, when you're thinking about those different birds and their migrations, did you choose those 4 species based on like kind of a regional prevalence, or is it because they stick around Michigan and they don't move around as much?
Yeah, we specifically chose these songbirds because they don't move as much from their like site. So these are very different from like migratory birds who like eat at different sites and like have breeding seasons in different sites. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I just think it's really cool how you can see like the feeding niches of the birds with mercury. I think that's so neat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So cool.
Thank you. So I'll introduce the next speaker, who is Brandon Ewert.
Great job, Saria.
Good job.
All right, hello everyone. Let's see. Okay, so my thesis is a little bit less hard science oriented. So it's called Discourse Dynamics in Colorado Fracking Rulemaking Debates. And my advisors were Dr. Paramon and Dr. Engstad. So I was following Senate Bill 19181, which was signed into law by Governor Polis on April 16th of 2019. And it's one of the most sweeping regulatory changes to the oil and gas industry in all of Colorado history. And basically what it does is give local governments the power to regulate oil and gas development on their own local scale. And essentially they can make restrictions that are stricter than the state's requirements. And it also changes the mission of the COGCC, or the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, from fostering the oil and gas industry to regulating it, which is a really big change because before the COGCC had denied less than 10 permits, but now their goal is to now regulate the industry. So, and I think it's important to note that at the time of this study, the bill was going through a rulemaking process, meaning the public has the chance to give their opinion and kind of shape how the bill is finalized. So I recorded 154 public comments at COGCC meetings, Air Quality Control Commission meetings, activist meetings, and the online portal that's COGCC set up from November 18th of last year to December 16th of last year. And my main work was to identify the stakeholder groups, as well as their key argument storylines, the sources of evidence they were using, and the causal stories that they leveraged in order to influence the rulemaking process. So I'll just jump into what I found. So on the left, you can see the stakeholder groups that I kind of identified using just my own judgment. So as well as the number of comments that they submitted. So you can see concerned citizens submitted the most comments, and these are people who are typically in favor of the bill and also concerned about the environmental and health impacts of fracking, followed by pro-oil and gas industry or anti-Senate Bill 9181 citizens, followed by anti-fracking activists, oil and gas industry employees and reps, elected officials, farmers, and the business community. So this is a map I created using GIS of public opinion towards the bill. So you can see all the counties in Colorado, and they're all shaded according to how many fracking wells they have. So up at the top, you can see Weld County has 43,000 wells. So if you've ever been there, they have a lot of fracking. And then the size of the circle is indicative of opinion. So the larger the circle, the more opposition I found to the Senate bill. And this was kind of just interesting for me to see whether or not there's a correlation between high fracking wells and people being either opposed or in support of this bill. But as you can see in the bottom left, Montezuma County has very little fracking and is very opposed to the bill. So I can't make that correlation. There's clearly some more complex things going on. Next, I looked at the types of evidence utilized by stakeholders in their comments. And most prominent were people referencing prior laws and regulations. More specifically, they were referencing Senate Bill 18167, which was passed in 2018, and places some additional regulations on oil and gas operators. And then followed by personal experience, scientific research about oil and gas activity came in third, industry know-how, specific quotes, so I'll get into that, and then a specific event. So these are the main types of evidence cited by people who are in favor of the bill. So they most often reference scientific research about the health or environmental impacts about fracking, followed by personal experience that they had had, maybe themselves or a loved one were suffering in some way because of fracking, followed by laws and regulations, oftentimes referencing the bill and the things they liked about it. And then these were the types of evidence cited by people who are not in favor of the bill. And you can see overwhelmingly they brought up laws and regulations. And in particular, they were saying that the prior Senate bill had not had enough time to go into effect, and we shouldn't be putting in more restrictions before that goes into place. And you can also see that 15 of them reference the same exact quote, which I found to be interesting. They pulled one word. Jared Polis was asked, "Can you still drill for oil in a blue state?" And he replied, "Yes, that's a silly question. It's like asking if you can build a solar farm in a red state." And they pulled the word silly from that and used it almost every meeting I went to, someone referenced that exact word. So that was interesting. Next, I kind of looked at the main argument storylines that were being utilized in these debates. And these were also identified by me. So the supporters of the Senate bill often were concerned about the environmental and health impacts of fracking, and were also drawn to the increased access to information about fracking that the bill brings. And people who were opposed to Senate bill had a much wider array of arguments against it, primarily saying that prior regulations need additional time, that the Senate bill is a political attack on oil and gas, that overregulation will threaten the state's economy, that fracking is safe, and in reference to the hydrofracking is safe argument, a lot of workers said, "Oh, we've had no injuries on any of our work days. Like the oil and gas industry is one of the safest there is to work in." And they were kind of equating worker safety with public safety about fracking. So that argument got a little bit interesting there. And finally, people stating Coloradans support oil and gas as a blanket statement. So some of the key findings of my paper were that there was a clear prioritization of government knowledge over other types of evidence. There's 36.08% of all comments referenced government knowledge, which makes sense since this is a rulemaking debate about a piece of legislation. The fact that people are bringing up previous laws makes a lot of sense, and it's in alignment with Baca et al. 2019, which found a privileging of government knowledge in these types of debates. And it also counters LAVE 2015, who found a horizontality of environmental knowledge utilization, meaning that a wide array of types of knowledge were being privileged and used in these debates. Whereas my research finds more of a verticality that government knowledge is privileged. And I also add to Stone's causal framework literature by identifying a new causal story, basically a new argument that shifts blame for a problem onto another actor by arguing that a lack of evidence actually demonstrates intentional harm and secret motives. And a lot of the supporters of the Senate bill often blame the oil and gas industry for keeping information from them, and that the Senate bill would increase access to information. So in conclusion, I think that as the impacts of fossil fuels and climate change become more widespread, legislation like this might act as a forced transition towards a cleaner energy future, environmental regulation, more localized decision-making. And the findings of the study also warrant future research regarding the effectiveness of different sources of evidence in rulemaking settings, the changing legitimacy of evidence sources and storylines, and the factors contributing to stakeholder unification in debates. And it's also really important to note that this was just a snapshot in time, like about a 1 month period, and this is still ongoing, so the public can still submit their comments, and it'll be interesting to see how this develops. And yeah.
I have a question, Brandon. That was so interesting. I have so many things. The one thing that I thought was sort of, I guess my first question is, you brought up the specific point of them using the same quote, and then this muddying of the waters between worker safety and public safety. And you didn't say it explicitly, but I'm just, maybe this is not a fair question for a thesis presentation, but I'm wondering if you think that that was an explicit campaign, right? Like that they were specifically being misled. Like, are these comments coming from a misled place, or are they, is this a piece of propaganda that they're themselves believing in and promoting? I don't know if my distinction is clear, but I'm just curious.
Yeah. That was something I was really interested in looking more into, and kind of seeing the sources of evidence that these stakeholders were using, and kind of seeing if there is some sort of strategic messaging that's happening, because it was really apparent that people were saying some of the same talking points over and over. So if I'd had more time, I would have liked to look into the sources of evidence in particular that people were using.
I have a related question. You said you distinguished between concerned citizens and activists. How did you determine that difference?
I typically said if people are a part of an activist organization and self-identified as being part of like 350 Colorado or a group like that, then I would put them as an activist, whereas concerned citizens were people who were speaking on behalf of just themselves and their own concerns.
Okay.
Brennan, this is Professor Lee. I may have missed this earlier, but did you explain how you went about identifying these themes? I know you said that these were ones that you developed more, but did you use a particular coding software or anything as you kind of try to figure out what were some common themes? And then the second question is, did you use any sort of observation, like participant observation as well, right? So not just looking at the comments, but also participant observation when you were trying to figure out what type of themes you thought would emerge?
In terms of kind of coding the comments, I used just a really elaborate Excel spreadsheet, basically trying to use, and I used Likert scores, scale 1 to 5, and that was kind of as quantitative as I got. And that was the main way I categorized things. And in terms of behavioral, I did not, it was a little bit difficult because I was in these like very formal settings where everyone was sitting at chairs, walking up to a mic, giving their comment. But if I had more time to collect comments, I think that would have been interesting to look at.
Awesome, thank you.
Fantastic, great job.
Good job, Brandon.
Introduce our next speaker, Brandon.
Okay, sorry, the next up is Lucy.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Sure can.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brandon. It's nice to see all your faces here today. So my project is titled A Stormwater Story, The Power and Politics of Urban Water Output in Colorado Springs. And so I'm going to spend my 8 minutes telling you a story. And I promise I also used theory and did all sorts of research, and I'll touch on that too. But I think what is so compelling about this work is the puzzle that I set out to solve. So in the spring of 1999, Colorado Springs experienced one of the worst floods in the city's history. When it rained heavily for 3 consecutive days. And here are some photos of the flooding. Bridges and roadways collapsed, and wastewater treatment plants were super overwhelmed by stormwater, so much so that one broke and others backed up so much that poop was coming up into people's basements and out of people's shower heads in southwestern Colorado Springs. So Colorado Springs Utilities decided, for the health and safety of the Colorado Springs residents, to release the untreated water down the creek to Pueblo in the lower Arkansas Valley. And weeks later, a farmer in the valley complained of toilet paper in their fields. And so in political science, there's a term called a triggering event, which is when something occurs and then it leads to political action towards solving the problem. And as this quote by an interviewee alludes to, people thought that this would be the wake-up call that Colorado Springs needed. But nearly 20 years later, Colorado Springs was sued in federal district court by the EPA and the state of Colorado for failure to comply with national stormwater regulation. And Pueblo and the Lower Arkansas Water Valley Conservation District also joined that as well. And that's a photograph of stormwater surge in Colorado Springs in the 2000s, and a headline that shows one of many articles where local journalists discuss the pending lawsuit. So I saw these two moments 20 years apart and wondered what had gone wrong. And I set out to answer these questions. What happened in Colorado Springs between the flood of 1999 and the lawsuit in 2016? Why did it take a federal lawsuit for the city to act? And what are the factors at play? And the objective of this study, given the questions I was considering and the puzzle I was trying to piece together, were to identify and consider the social, environmental, political, and economic factors which ultimately led to the mismanagement of stormwater in the area. And so I'm going to walk you through this schematic of my findings, which I created. What I found overall is that all the factors which influence the story are really interwoven with each other. So first of all, the physical landscape, represented here by this greenish outline, is a major influence. In Colorado Springs, we have steep terrain that meets the plains very abruptly, a small creek that struggles to absorb high rates of runoff, and fairly impervious soils. And then we add human action. So first, the city begins to grow and develop pretty rapidly with a lot of sprawl and a lot of concrete. And then the city starts to buy up more and more water rights to support a growing population. At the same time, local politicians are making decisions and defining the plans of the city, while the community is pushing back on taxes and fees, like a stormwater fee being implemented. So then the increase in development and water input puts strain on existing infrastructure, and the city is unable to maintain that infrastructure because of the tax-averse community. This lack of proper infrastructure and funding degrades the creek and waterways, both increasing quantity and decreasing quality of water leaving the city downstream. And regional tensions escalate as Colorado Springs asserts its power in the region as an upstream and wealthy municipality. And here's a quote by a Colorado Springs official who I interviewed that I think says a lot about this case study. "You couldn't have scripted a worse place to build so many impervious surfaces and in so much built environment." So just to touch on the nitty-gritty of my work, I've compiled a few important things that you need to know about the study. First of all, my methodology. I began by conducting archival research based on local news sources. I then interviewed local experts, including city officials and informed stakeholders. Then I conducted a review of relevant theory, which I'll touch on a bit more in a minute. Then I thematically coded interviews using a series of themes which I had identified as important throughout earlier research. And finally, I analyzed and cross-compared the theory and my own research to dive deeper into this story. So for my theoretic lens, I utilized urban political ecology and the concept known as the hydrosocial cycle. And here's an illustration of the hydrosocial cycle, which points out that human action and the hydraulic cycle are intertwined, and you really cannot consider one without the other. So basically what you need to know is that we cannot separate what we consider natural processes from people and their politics. And yes, this is even true, or especially true, in cities. So now that you've had a bit more time to think about this case study, I wanted to show this schematic again. And remember, the greenish outline represents the physical properties of the region which are at play. And it's clear that the theoretical hydrosocial cycle is very applicable to a case study as well. And I've added a couple quotes from interviews to share with you as we review this one more time. So I'll give you a few moments to read them while I go through this. So we experienced rapid growth here in Colorado Springs. And these are all quotes from my interviews. And this rapid growth has catalyzed an expansion of our water portfolio. And the local political climate has also impacted the story, and the community's tax aversion has minimized funding towards stormwater. All of these factors have led to strained and underfunded stormwater infrastructure. And this has had both environmental and social impacts. So Colorado Springs truly is the perfect storm for the implications of stormwater management. And honestly, that pun was an accident, but it is pretty good. So why do this work? So what? Locally, this work has impact because it provides a fuller context to what has gone on, which has otherwise been pretty unclear and pretty murky. But maybe poop coming out of showers and the mysteries of Colorado Springs government aren't what you're interested in, and you're still wondering why this matters. This story also has theoretical importance because it shows that an urban stormwater story is interwoven with the social, economic, and political attributes of the city. And it shows that people and natural landscapes have been and continue to be inseparable from one another. So before I wrap up and take questions, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the ED department and thank you all so much for your contributions to our college experience. I especially want to shout out my advisors, Professor Gratz, Professor McKendry, and Professor Paramond for all of their support. We couldn't have done any of this without all of you. And with that, thanks for listening. I'm happy to take some questions if we have time.
I have a question. So I'm just curious, and I don't know the answer, so this is not that type of question, just before I state it. So there's two problems, right, with water in Colorado Springs and the problems downstream. One is the fact that we are shipping all this water in and we're changing how much water is then going downstream. And then the other part is what you spent more of your time talking about. And I'm just, in terms of impervious cover and stormwater and like the effects of, you know, a more flashy system. So but I honestly don't know what the sort of the components of those are in terms of this larger problem, in terms of erosion, E. coli problems from wastewater, infrastructure failure. I don't really actually know the different contributions of those two problems. I was just curious if you had a sense.
So you're asking sort of the things that bring those two ideas together?
Well, so the problem that you're describing with downstream is a result of two problems, and you actually brought both of those problems together in your schematic in your story, which I thought was great in terms of water acquisition as well as stormwater management. But those are two separate things, and I'm just curious how they come together in terms of the problem that you identified in terms of just relative problematicness, or I don't have the right words, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think I set out to try to figure out about the issues of increased quantity and decreased quality, but I did find that issues of increased runoff, increased erosion, increased amounts of E. coli and other pollutants in the water going downstream was part of the issue. But the whole stormwater story really does back up to the fact that Colorado Springs has experienced so much growth and has brought in a lot of water into a system that can't handle that amount of water that it's brought in. So I would say that all of these things are very intertwined, and I'm not exactly sure how to take apart each piece for you right now. I'm not exactly sure what piece you're asking about, but if you want to shoot me an email, I'd be happy to answer this question.
Lucy, is this an environmental justice issue?
It definitely is. I would say that only certain municipalities can hold the power to choose to regulate the way that they're supposed to or choose not to. And being an upstream municipality gives Colorado Springs that power. And I would say that there are a multitude of environmental justice issues in this case study. And most of them are based on how the upstream municipality of Colorado Springs is sending water downstream to Pueblo, to Fountain, to downstream users who don't have the ability to choose what water they're receiving.
Yeah. Lucy, I have a question. Why did it take a lawsuit? You started with that question. Why didn't people start addressing it 16 years before the lawsuit? Why the 16 years and the lawsuit before any action?
Yeah, I think a lot of things have caused that. I think people really didn't want to pay a fee before then. The government here in Colorado Springs entered into a lot of negotiations with the region, in which the region tried to get them to manage stormwater, but the only way to really manage stormwater is to implement a fee. And Colorado Springs was the last municipality on the Front Range to implement a stormwater fee, and it's also one of the lowest. And so I really think that it is based on this sort of libertarian, tax-averse community that exists. People really don't want to see more bills in their mail and more bills that they have to pay. Cool, thanks. I believe the next person is Carly.
Good job, Lucy. Thanks.
Okay, so I also did my thesis with Becca. So following Cherry's presentation where she looked at soil carbon processes, I looked at the impact of severe fire on stream carbon export and metabolism across this mesic montane landscape. So again, for more background, with climate change, rising temperatures, changing in precipitation patterns, we're expecting to see a larger, more severe fires and an increase in frequency of them. And so this changes the Western landscape because these Western forests are known to be carbon sinks, but when all of the forest is burned and releases CO2, they then become a source. But what's interesting in our study is that we wanted to look at this 17 years post-fire. So what is the landscape doing now? And is it still acting as a source? Okay, so my main three research questions were: one, how does fire alter the transport of this carbon within the terrestrial aquatic interface? Two, how are the characteristics of exported carbon altered by fire? And three, how is the fate of carbon influenced by fire? So next, like Cherry, I used 5 different sites, 2 of which were forested watersheds and 3 were burned watersheds. I used GIS to see how many or what percentage of the burned watershed had experienced fire. So we ranged in extent from 28, 54 to 82% burned, and then each of these streams I measured discharge, dissolved organic carbon, specific UV absorbance, which is a proxy for aromaticity of the carbon, nitrogen constituents, base cations, and we looked at the C13 signatures of the carbon within the streams, both organic and inorganic. Yeah. Then also using long-term measuring devices, using dissolved organic oxygen, Then we modeled NEP, ER, and GPP. So the first result was that we found that water shield increased significantly with burned extent. So this makes sense because forested landscapes have less vegetation and therefore less evapotranspiration. Additionally, we suspect that there's a change in flow paths along this burned soil that increases flow generation runoff generation. Okay, so then we found that the DOC concentrations between these watersheds didn't actually vary between burned and unburned sites. However, the yield tended to increase with extent burned. So this indicates that the increase in water yield plays a huge role in mobilizing the carbon within these landscapes. So then we use the C13 signatures to trace where the sources are possibly coming from. So carbon within streams can come from two major sources, that is terrestrial and aquatic. And the aquatic sources come from GPP. And each of these sources delivers a different C13 signature. So you can see over here, I have that atmospheric CO2 tends to have a signature about -8. And then this is soil respiration as measured by Cherry, and then this is the soil carbon C13. So we find that the inorganic carbon within these streams tends to follow the signatures of those of the terrestrial carbon sources rather than the in situ processes. And this makes sense because the ecosystem respiration within these streams tends to be pretty small because they are such small headwater streams. So now that we know that most of the carbon is coming from terrestrial sources, we see that a difference in terrestrial source can change the aromaticity. I can't see the timer, but so then we can see that it changes the temporal variability as well as the source of where it comes from. Sorry, I don't know what time I'm at. And so this basically, all of this suggested that we are seeing a greater fraction of exported carbon within these burned landscapes, which could lead to a positive impact, a positive feedback, reducing the amount of vegetative recovery that can occur. Yeah. Okay. Stop sharing. Okay, questions.
Hey, Carly, that's really interesting stuff. Can you explain to others what you mean by aromaticity? I think that might be one of those terms that a lot of people don't exchange on an everyday basis unless they were involved with the research.
Yeah, so aromaticity basically describes the carbon structure, and basically that structure can determine how labile it is or bioavailable. Yeah. Yeah, and I have knowledge of anything. Okay.
All right, everybody, thanks to Carly.
Good job, Carly!
Great job.
And Francis is next.
Looks like a teacher. Miro has an accent because he's from like Czechoslovakia.
Okay. Whoops. Okay, can you guys hear me? Sweet. Cool. So my thesis is on the effects of neighbors and snowpack on seedling establishment and mortality on Pikes Peak, Colorado. And our site is an abrupt treeline site. Before we talked about a lot of diffuse sites, but this one is a little different because it's abrupt. So yeah, and this has been sort of a project for the past 3 years for me and some other people. So yeah, it's a lot of the data was taken before just my thesis block. Oops. Cool. So an abrupt treeline has a very narrow transition zone from the forest to the tundra, and this is a picture of it, the exact site. As you can see, there's some larger trees higher up and some areas of just more scarce.
This is so simple, this looks like high school. Hers is like complex. But I know she was nervous off and on. Yeah. Like at times she was very comfortable with it.
Okay, so abrupt treeline form. That's a picture of the abrupt treeline from below. And some mechanisms enforcing the spatial structure are growth limitation, so that could be bud freezing in the winter, or desiccation or drying out of needles from sun. Dieback, which it can be breakage from freezing or wind damage, and seedling mortality, which I focus on in this thesis, which can happen from freezing, snow fungi, which start growing when the snow starts melting, and drought. And then talking about neighborhood interactions, a really important factor is the proximity to tree islands, or clusters of larger trees, because that determines the amount of sun, nutrients, and sheltering that a seedling will receive. And then that sheltering sort of drives the wind patterns at the tree line, which in turn drive the snow patterns at the tree line. So the islands will sort of create eddies around them, and that will determine the depth of snow in certain areas and the distribution of snow as well. So that sort of made us question, how do neighbors of various sizes at various distances from seedlings affect seedling establishment and mortality? So for some pros and cons to snow and seedling growth, snow burial can help. It can protect seedlings from sun damage and desiccation. It can maintain their temperature during the winter time, and the melting snowpack will provide buried seedlings with moisture during the growing season when it starts warming up. Snow burial can also hurt because the melting of the snowpack causes snow fungi to form, which has been said in this study to be the #1 cause of seedling mortality. So that made us ask, how does snow distribution and depth affect seedling establishment and mortality? So methods. Okay, so we divided the site into ecozones, the forest, the lower sheltered, the upper sheltered, and the tundra. The forest is marked sort of just by the kind of obvious line of dense trees and when they start scarcing out. And then the tundra was marked by the lowest elevation of windswept trees. For data collection, we marked 2,438 seedlings exactly. And the seedlings were defined as above 10 centimeters and below 50 centimeters. And we did this in the summer of 2017 and 2018. And then we also did snowpack depths taken in May of 2019. We got their GPS locations and the exact depths of the snow so we could compare it later to the drone image. And the seedlings were given a new assessment in 2019, this past summer, to see if they had died or if they were still alive. For GIS, I had to correct the depths in the snow DEM. I had to cut it up into strips and raster calculate, and then compare that to the actual measured depths, and it worked really well, so that was really cool. And then we split up the snow into depth categories, our being no snow, and then going up by 20 centimeter increments until our highest snow. And I did buffer analysis around tree canopy polygons, took the area of the digitized canopy polygons and made them small and large trees, and then did 1 meter and 2 meter buffers around them. So just to sort of orient you in the GIS space, these would be the canopies, the snow polygon, and the picture on the right is the classified snow polygons. So results for neighbors, we did chi-square tests performed for each buffer around small trees and large trees. A small tree would be a tree that was between 0.5 meter squared and 5 meters squared, and a large tree would be over 5 meters squared. And so we saw an underrepresentation of seedlings in 1 meter buffers around both large and small trees in the lower sheltered zone and the upper sheltered zone. So that suggests competition, which was sort of interesting because it kind of goes against the stress gradient hypothesis that we've been talking about. But when we talk about spatial mortality in relation to that, it still seems like if you look at the lower sheltered zone mortality rates, it still seems like it's beneficial for seedlings to be closer to large trees in the lower sheltered zone because their mortality rates are much lower there than outside the buffers. This relationship kind of flips in the upper sheltered zone, and that's why we want probably in the future to define these zones more closely based on snow depth and distribution rather than just an arbitrary cut in the middle of the sheltered zone. For snow, we saw a strong overrepresentation of seedlings within the snow polygon when we did a chi-square for that. And this is really cool. Our seedling mortality versus snow depth quadratic regression, we did like, it shows a clear sweet spot where the medium snow, so around like 75 or 50 to 80 centimeters, you see way less mortality than in the really shallow snow and the really deep snow. So we were really excited about that because it totally correlates with other literature that is similar, and yeah, it's really exciting. So to sort of put it all together, it's more likely for seedlings to survive at the harsh conditions at this site if they establish near larger trees, even if the area is more competitive. So we haven't seen a lot of facilitation happening necessarily, but the facilitation that comes from the sheltering from the climatic conditions from these islands are actually making these areas better for seedlings to establish and survive there. Yeah. So I want to say thanks to a lot of people. This has been a really long study, but some of the people that you've actually seen present today have helped me collect a lot of data, and I want to say thanks. Thanks, Darren, for helping with the drones. Matt Cooney obviously helped with everything GIS related, and obviously Miro. Not only did he teach us how to do all this, but he also taught us how to forage for mushrooms. So yeah, it's been great.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Good job.
I don't believe that mushroom's real.
No, it is.
No, I know.
Mushroom, not to scale.
You made me forget my question though, Francis.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
I have like a super nerdy technical one on the GIS front, which is
That's my favorite.
when you're measuring between a surface to the DEM measure for the snow top, and you did a raster calculator in strips, right? Mm-hmm. So you had ultra precise mapping for the depth of the snow. And that's
right.
Why it's critical to tie that to the mortality of the seedlings. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, so that's probably, it's probably the most complicated thing that I did in the GIS side. But so we kind of had to take points from an orthomosaic that we did a year ago in the summer with no snow.
Right.
And then I had to take those points and tie them to points with no snow in the snow DEM, if that makes sense.
Gotcha.
And, so I had to make sure that they were right. And then after I did that, and it didn't really work when I did it in one strip because there was so much warping and you're on an angle already. And it was really hard to get ground control points when there's snow on the ground everywhere, I'm sure. I wasn't there when they did it, and then, so after that, I did all the raster calculations and compared it to the actual depths we did, and they lined up really, really well. So that was sort of like what made me able to do my entire thesis. So
cool.
that was awesome.
My apologies to everyone else. Really interesting.
Other questions? Awesome. Good job, Francis! Woo!
Cool. So next up is Alexa. And Alexa actually helps me with a lot of the stuff that I did, and she's presented with me a lot. But she didn't do her thesis on Treeline. She did her thesis in the Bahamas. So cool, refreshing, awesome presentation. Yay.
So anyway, that other guy was pointing at Noah Hirschhorn, who plays lacrosse. Carly says he's getting a doctorate in atmospheric chemistry, and he's practically teaching the class that she's auditing.
Oh, okay. There you go, Alexa.
Yeah, I think I'm. Wait. Okay, sorry. All right. So yeah, I have worked with Francis or can everyone hear me? Yes, okay, cool. So I have worked with Francis, but I did do my thesis on something else. And so my thesis was uncovering the spatial and temporal assemblage of pelagic species using boat-based transect surveys in the Exuma Sound in the Bahamas. And just so for some background on this, pelagic ecosystems are the open ocean marine water column from the surface to the sediments on the ocean floor, and they actually account for about 99% of the entire biosphere, which is very interesting. And so due to the very dynamic composition of this system, they are very hard to study and therefore to conserve. So, excuse me, sorry. The Bahamas actually is working towards protecting 20% of their coastal and marine habitats by the end of 2020, but there's a large gap in their pelagic knowledge. So this study has actually been created by researchers down in the Cape Eleuthera Institute in the Bahamas in order to try to address that pelagic gap and then hopefully help create these pelagic protected areas in the future. And so this study was using boat-based transect surveys to investigate seasonal diversity, abundance, and interaction of pelagic species. And then this study is preliminary. I worked with about a year's worth of data, but they're hoping to extend this for a couple years to get a better idea of community interactions. And then also have this study serve as kind of a basis for additional studies to branch off of it. There's already been a marine mammal one that's come out of this, which has been pretty cool. And so the methodology behind this, I did a bunch of different things, but kind of the collection process was there's 2 parallel transects run, as you can see in this image here. And one was over about 500 meters of water and the other over about 1,000 meters of water. And so before each of these transects were started, environmental variables were collected, such as wind direction, speed, and more. And then during transects, whenever an individual was sighted, the GPS location was recorded, and then the species was identified down to the lowest taxonomic level as possible from whatever distance we were at. And then, so in taking these sightings, then I calculated sightings per unit effort, which has helped to estimate the relative abundance of species present just based off of the number of sightings and the effort of the individuals running the transect. And then these SBUEs were then analyzed against various environmental factors to try to find patterns in community structure. And so we looked at things from wind direction, wind speed, transect location from the deeper to shallower transects, and then also season to try to find some patterns within species. And then so there was 28 different species found across 5 different species groups. And then below, this is sort of the equation that I made, and then we'll later change throughout the study, but yes. And then, so kind of the major part of my analysis was looking at correlations between species sightings. So this is kind of trying to see how they're maybe interacting within space and time. So I looked at temporal correlations, seeing which species occur during the same time / environmental conditions, and then also spatial. And this is where I brought in GIS to see which species co-occur in the same geographic locations. So I overlaid a fishnet over our study site and kind of assigned the different sightings to the different boxes, and then was able to run a correlation matrix on these different sightings to see significant relations within the same geographic space. And then, so the most important part though of these 2 correlations is the overlap, to kind of see which species may be co-varying within the same space and time, indicative of direct interactions. And so I got, over the course of the studies, I did a bunch of different analysis. I got a lot of really interesting data out of this, and specifically with seasonality too. So in the end, I'm happy to answer any questions on that, but I decided to focus my attention on the spatio-temporal relationships that reveal themselves. And due to kind of having to adjust to a really high significance level, or low, I guess, only 2 spatio-temporal relationships revealed themselves to be significant, both with the bird and tuna groups. And And then, so there was the general bird group and the general tuna group that correlated, and then also brown noddies, which is in this picture above, which is a specific type of seabird, and then the tuna group. And so in kind of doing some background research, brown noddies typically feed on small fish and pelagic squid. And then also, even though tunas are a very large group of species, they typically feed on epipelagic fish, squid, and crustaceans. So there is a significant diet overlap, which is indicative that they are feeding on the same prey or in the same prey feeding aggregations as each other. And then this can actually then be extended over to the general bird group, because within the majority of our identifiable species within this study, they also feed on these pelagic small fish and pelagic squid, just like the tunas. And then beyond just diet overlap, there's past studies on seabirds have shown that they associate with subsurface predators, because the subsurface predators drive this prey to the surface, so then they're feeding from below and then the birds are feeding from above. And then specifically brown noddies have been known to forage in association with tuna groups more frequently than if it was just chance alone, which is very interesting. And even though these aren't new findings, it is cool to see it in this area. And so some conclusions to draw from this. Overall, this study has been a valuable first glance into the associations of various species within the northeastern Exuma Sound, as well as establishing kind of a baseline for abundance and diversity within the epipelagic zone of these waters. And something interesting to move forward with this project is to focus on the birds, because past studies have shown that they are highly effective proxies for conservation of other species, and actually have been used as indicators for ecosystem health and establishing biological hotspots in the open ocean. And then researchers have already gone as far to use them as indicators and monitoring and helping to monitor marine pelagic areas, which is what this study aims to help to do. And so another reason they're highly effective proxies is they often have overlap with other top predators such as whales and sharks. And so therefore they kind of can be indicative of the entire ecosystem. And then to kind of like sum it up, through gathering more knowledge of the bird community of the Exuma Sound, we will be able to get an understanding of the overall productivity of the ecosystem, and possibly then using it as a mechanism to assist the Bahamas in establishing marine protected areas within these pelagic waters. And so I'd like to thank Miro for helping me out as my first reader and helping me pore over this data set, my advisors down at the Cape of Luther Institute that I worked with, and then also Matt Cooney for spending many hours in GIS Lab with me. And is there any questions?
Thanks, Alexa. Any questions for Alexa?
So, Alexa, what's how does your group interface with the efforts in Bahamas to establish those marine protected areas?
They work pretty closely with Bahama National Trust to create these different programs, and the Nature Conservancy down there, because they're the largest marine lab in the Bahamas and have kind of a range of projects. And so they've already worked pretty closely with a lot of other fisheries management projects, and they actually worked with CEI to kind of create their plan for their 20% by 2020. And then also CEI was kind of in charge and looking at those gaps of where these where these marine protected areas are and aren't. And so they've kind of been throughout this whole time working with the Bahamas directly. So it's cool to know that this project will actually have some greater implications, which is cool.
Any other questions?
Alexa, my head unit failed me there for a second. I was just curious about the types of tuna that you were encountering there. You had one, shot of a particular tuna. I know there are 2 or 3 that are really important in that region, the Bahamas. Just curious if you had a specific.
We were, at least for that, the sightings that we saw the tuna on transect, it was hard to identify species because they were just in an aggregate of feeding. Yeah. But commonly in the Bahamas, there's a bunch of different species. I think specifically skipjack tuna is known to associate with birds specifically, so they're thinking it was probably that, or little tunny, which is within the family of tuna, and a couple other species. But the one in the picture, those are mahi.
Those are mahi. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I just didn't have a picture of tuna, so the next best thing.
Curious.
All right, so thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alexa.
Well, I think that is that's everyone, right?
Yeah.
Yep. We're all good.
It's good to see everybody.
Yeah, it was, and I was just keeping track every once in a while. I think we had up in the low 40s there for attendance for a while. So it was great to have all of you come out to support each other. Thanks to faculty for coming out and supporting the students, and for all the friends and family who are still out there. I think it was great that we had this opportunity to see and hear from everybody, and it was really exciting, for a geologist to be listening to all this ecology and study sort of work was a lot of fun. So I appreciate you guys taking the time and putting the work into it. I think that's it. I think we're done. Maybe with just one more round of applause. Thanks for everybody for taking the time out of the day.
It was really great, everybody.
Yeah, that was a really strong group of presentations. That was really
really was.
Really nice job. Super polished and articulate.
Yeah.
Nice job, everyone.
Is that your graduation hat?
No, Eric, I love the hat.
Oh, that was just me doing formal wear for like 30 seconds.
Oh.
In the honor of the seniors, Don't get used to it.
Congratulations, everyone.
Yeah. Good to see everybody. Cheers.
Take care.